Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week we are discussing chapter 1 of Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, and it's entitled Don't Think of a Household. And the issue here is that Kelton claims that a lot of the problems we have in terms of our government being able to do what it needs to do to maximally support the people is being constrained by the fact that policymakers, economists, and everyday people are thinking of the government as analogous to a household, and the government's spending constraints are analogous to a household's spending constraints. So we're going to go straight into the book with the first quote here. I will read it off. If I can find it, here it is. Myth number 1, the federal government should budget like a household. Reality, unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends. Now, when Kelton uses the word currency, she means base money. I like to say that issuing base money is really just a form of government borrowing. That might sound weird because the government isn't taking something and agreeing to give it back later. Colloquially, we tend to think of borrowing as when you take something temporarily, especially money, and promise to return it in the future. It's a two-sided transaction. It's a trade. As the borrower, you're trading a promise of money in the future for a lesser amount of money in the present. As a lender, you're trading money now in exchange for more money in the future. The debt itself is the promise. It is a liability of the borrower. Now, it is, of course, possible to issue a debt without taking anything in exchange. In other words, you could, if you wanted to, just go into debt by just making the promise. Whether we decide to call this naked promise borrowing is somewhat of a semantic issue, but my preference is to label any issuance of debt as borrowing. It's simpler that way. Now, I said that issuing money is a form of borrowing. That's because each dollar that the government issues represents a promise to pay consumer goods. They're saying that you can redeem this dollar for a dollar's worth of goods. And the idea is that a dollar can claim a consistent amount of stuff from day to day. The promise that the government is making is a promise of price level stability. Each dollar that the government issues is therefore a form of debt, and we use it as money because the government is able to keep the promise of stable purchasing power. So Kelton's claim is that unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends. Essentially, she's emphasizing that we use the government's debt as our money. We also use bank debt as our money. The deposits that you have in your checking account are really a promise to give you cash when you ask for it. But we often spend those deposits as money without actually withdrawing them from our bank accounts. Now, that's exactly what you're doing when you buy something using your debit card. But individual households and individual people don't use their own debt as money, at least not directly. Instead, we have to go to a bank and issue some of our own debt in exchange for some of the bank's debt, i.e. deposits. That's what it means to take out a loan. Essentially, what the bank is doing is vouching for us. They're saying that our debt is as good as money. And they're putting their money where their mouth is by accepting our promise in the form of a loan and issuing us deposits that we can spend right away with people who don't need to know us or trust us. So there is a sense in which everyone, households and governments alike, can issue money and spend it. That's what borrowing is, after all. But it's also true that the government is in a special position at the top of the hierarchy. Our debt is a promise to pay bank deposits. Bank deposits are a promise to pay government-issued base money, and government-issued base money is a promise to pay goods. All of this is to say that government debt follows the same general rules as everyone else's debt, but because of their position in the hierarchy, the government is able to manage their debt differently than maybe what you're used to thinking about from the perspective of a household. This chapter is all about highlighting those differences, but I wanted to make sure we established some of the similarities first.
That's a good summary of your perspective on it. I mean, I will just reemphasize here that Stephanie Kelton is looking for a simple way of describing this phenomenon of what's special about base money and how is it different from other stuff, what makes the government spending different. And, I think we agree that that's a really important project. And you brought up a lot of stuff that I don't think quite sort of plays nice with the simple analogies that she's using. I've become a big fan of this word you're using a lot, promise. because that makes it clearer. And I think I totally understand what you mean about how we can think of the government spending as still as borrowing, right? Even when it's fiat spending money. That makes sense to me because all the borrowing that we do in the private sector is also there's an issuance there. There's a creation of a promise, and a promise makes that clear because we make promises, right? Before we made the promise, there was nothing, and then we create this promise by making it on the spot. And then really the question is, what makes some promises more valuable than others? And so if we can start to think of all money, right, including base money, as a particularly valuable kind of promise, right? That I think can make sense of it. Whereas, that can help us resolve this apparent conflict, this apparent contradiction, which isn't really a contradiction between the government spending and government borrowing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I just want to emphasize something that you said as importantly different from how Stephanie Kelton is talking about things. So you say at the top of the hierarchy, the government is promising to pay goods, which is something that Stephanie Kelton kind of gets at very indirectly, but not directly in terms of talking about it as government debt, like a debt to pay goods. And so this can probably help explain some of the language differences in how you would talk about it versus her, because when she's talking about government debt in this chapter, she's talking about debts that are denominated in dollars. And so she's really emphasizing that the US prints the dollars to pay the dollars. So like we really need to understand that those debts are to pay dollars don't function in the way that we might think our debts to pay dollars do. So I think that's, talking about goods, it's a little bit different because the government doesn't just print goods for essentially for free. So I think that's an important distinction. And you did say it, but you said it quickly. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, what she's maybe leaving out is that dollars are in some sense denominated in goods, right? And that's what the price level is.
Yeah.
So let's get to the next quote. Here we go. We know that we're supposed to live within our means and arrange our finances so that we aren't spending more than we bring in. So this is an interesting point because household spending doesn't have to come from borrowing. It can also come from money we take in, payments we receive in a higher form of money than our own debt. For the government, the only higher form of money is goods. And rather than maintaining inventories of goods, they simply use fiscal and monetary policy to manage the flow of goods and the flow of money. When the government provides services directly to the people, that is in some ways equivalent to spending goods into the economy. And it's true that they can't provide more goods and services than they're able to bring in or produce. So in that sense, the government is like a household, but everything is occurring at a higher level in the hierarchy.
Yeah. This is just, we should probably go to get further into her more detailed quotes, but just something to earmark here is that, we know we're supposed to live within our means and arrange our finances so we aren't spending more than we bring in. Does that imply that this is different from the government? The first part of that, like they shouldn't live within their means, right? So there probably are a lot of similarities here. There might even be more similarities than there are differences. I think more than she's letting on.
Yeah, that's right. And for the government, living within their means, of course, means living within what real resources they have available to them. And MMT talks about this, but they talk about it almost as something separate from how you'd think of a household.
I feel like it's useful to understand how what she means is correct and then to understand how what she means is incorrect, in the sense that if you're already starting from a perspective of thinking that living within your means as the government means a balanced budget dollar for dollar, then that's what she's challenging. Like that's what she's saying is incorrect. And then I think you and Alex and Derek, you're adding kind of another layer where like, well, from this other perspective, it is kind of like a household. But if you jump that middle step, then you might still have the misconception, that it's about dollar for dollar. So I just
right.
Yeah,
no,
that's right.
Very true.
Yeah, it's important. The key distinction between the household and the government is that they do operate at different levels of the hierarchy. So, as a household, we're budgeting dollar for dollar, and as the government, you're budgeting resource for resource, because that's what sits above you in the hierarchy, immediately above you in the hierarchy. So it's analogous, but there is an important difference in terms of the position in the hierarchy. So let's get to the next one here. Did I bring it up properly? No. Here we go. Can you create US dollars? Sure, you can earn them, but can you manufacture them? Maybe with high-tech engraving equipment, you could set up shop in your basement and produce something that looks very much like the US dollar. Or maybe you could hack into the computer at the Federal Reserve and type up some digital dollars. But we both know that you'll end up in an orange jumpsuit if you get caught trying to counterfeit the currency. That's because the US Constitution grants the federal government the exclusive right to issue currency. As the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis put it, the US government is the sole manufacturer of dollars. So we don't need to bring the US Constitution into this discussion at all. Anyone can make dollar-denominated promises, of course, as we said. And if you're making promises on someone else's behalf, the government or otherwise, that's fraud. You'll end up in an orange jumpsuit. And keep in mind that most of the money we spend in our economy is not government-issued base money, what Kelton calls currency. Most of our US dollars are issued by someone else. We are each the sole manufacturer of the dollars that we happen to issue, is one way to think about it.
She's approaching a really important point, which is there's this difference we all sense where we're not able to, we don't have this kind of spending power. Something's different. We can't. Most people don't really see themselves as currency issuers, right? And they're not. So that's important. But when she goes into her theory about what makes that, what causes that difference, that's where I think it sort of falls apart, because there's lots of other institutions in the economy that are creating money, and it's really not just the government. Most of the money that we're spending is not the base money that's originally issued. And Alex, you've been saying this a lot, that she's talking specifically about base money, but I think that's really important to highlight, that like if you're looking to Stephanie Kelton to try to understand what money is, what currency is, you have to recognize that she's not talking about the vast majority of what we spend at stores, because that is created in this other way by banks, by private lending firms who do not quite have the spending power of the government, who do not quite have the fiat spending power of the government, but nevertheless, they do have something that you don't, right? They have a power that you don't, because they're further up this hierarchy of credit. Their promises that they're issuing are just more valuable than mine. Now, maybe if I really put my back into it, like I could become, a great lender or something, a great borrower, and start to get to that kind of, start to climb up the ladder a little bit. But that takes work, and that you have to be good at it. That has to become your business to do that in the private sector. So That's true even within that sector, right? You don't have to suddenly jump over and say it's only coming from the public sector for that to be true. This same phenomenon occurs everywhere throughout the economy. It's not just a unique property of the government or a unique property of them signing, a law that says you can't counterfeit or something.
Yeah, and that's exactly what a bank is, right? They make a business out of issuing liabilities that other people trust, that people can exchange and use as money. And the central bank, of course, sits at the top of all the banks.
So that was the first thought that I had, is that money is created other ways. But then, of course, at the same time, I think all of those institutions face some kind of liquidity and solvency constraints in dollars that I think she's pointing out the federal government doesn't face. So I think, again, you can sort of make that distinction, that the federal government can issue new dollars to pay back all of its debts and meet all of its liquidity and solvency constraints, at least in the short term, kind of ignoring inflation and other problems that could happen. And a bank can kind of maybe do that, but not really, right? There is some liquidity constraint. It has to be able to find the dollars. Maybe it has a really easy way of finding them most of the time, but it does have to be able to find them. It can't print them. And banks can go under, and we did see some of this in the financial crisis. So I think that's still a distinction worth emphasizing, although, yeah.
I think what you're bringing into the discussion is the hard constraint that banks face in terms of maintaining the par value of their deposits. When you withdraw your $100 of deposits, you don't want to get $98. That is the bank fails at that. That's a complete failure of the bank. If something similar happens with the government and you spend $100 and you only get $98 worth of goods compared to what you were expecting, that's inflation. And it's not a complete kind of binary failure. It's not like you're either solvent or you're not, you're either liquid or you're not. It is kind of a partial failure, but banks aren't allowed to do that. They have to maintain par in order to maintain the payment system, the integrity of the unit of the United States dollar, that kind of thing. So the government does have some more flexibility there, even though they can still fail in the same way. It's just not a hard failure.
I like that distinction. Where do you think that comes from, right? Why is it that when you become the base money issuer and everyone's all the market transactions are denominated in this unit. Like how does it get more diffuse like that? Why is it that we're no longer thinking about this individual firm's liquidity constraint?
Yeah, I mean, all the constraints are still there. They're just looser. So if you're the central bank and you're on a gold standard, you have something above you that's very specific. And when various countries were on the gold standard, some of them did have to suspend specie payments for a period of time, that kind of thing, and it ended up not completely destroying their economies most of the time. But there's something more analogous there in that you have a specific exact amount that people can come to you and claim. Whereas if you're just maintaining the price level, then the claim is more implicit. Like you could have a gold standard where instead of the central bank holding a reserve of gold, they're really maintaining the fixed price of gold in the market by going into the market and buying and selling. That would be an equivalent gold standard. So instead of having an inventory of gold on their own balance sheet, they use the entire economy as their inventory of gold, and they make sure the price is where they need it to be. And that's kind of like what we're doing, but it's even looser since it's not just specifically gold. It's a basket of goods. People aren't thinking, I'm pricing this gallon of milk in terms of some fraction of a house, some fraction of like all the other goods or something like that. They're thinking the unit is kind of the common language. So we kind of anchor to that, and then it's up to the government to keep that frame of reference stable. So we can kind of treat it as a fixed frame of reference on which we hang all of our prices and that kind of thing. So it really is analogous, but the government does have more flexibility. But you can't just allow an arbitrary amount of inflation or deflation, or your currency will fail and people will find something else to use as their standard. But this is an important difference once you get to that level of the hierarchy, and you're getting to the point where what's above you in the hierarchy is not denominated in the standard unit anymore. Right. So I think that's what allows a lot more flexibility for the government, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to re-summarize for someone who might be new to this, like you're putting forth a view that's, whereas Stephanie Kelton is saying that like there's this kind of elemental difference between the private sector and the public sector, where you get this special ability that we don't have when you're the government. You're saying that actually there's this fundamental survival constraint or liquidity constraint that's kind of underpinning all of this. The promises have to be good for something. And it's just that once you get to the top and you're now managing the whole economy, influencing the whole economy with your policy, once you really get to the tippy top of that, then it sort of spreads out and you get this, it looks looser. It looks like this, oh, well, now prices are going up on average. And it's not an immediate, like you're out of business, you close shop, but it still very much has to do with like, we are meeting our obligations. We are continually making good on our promises.
Yeah, and the price level is less of a fixed hard constraint than the par relationship that banks have to maintain between their deposits and the cash.
But it's still like a real one. Like we know that we can have 2%, 3%, it's fine. But we all know that we can't just do that forever. We can't just let it go.
You can't have arbitrarily high levels of inflation or deflation.
It matters somewhere. Yeah,
people will find something else. Yeah, to use as their money. Yeah, exactly. So let's get into the next quote, which is actually one I skipped by accident. Here we go. MMT takes as its starting point a simple and incontrovertible fact. Our national currency, the US dollar, comes from the US government, and it can't come from anywhere else, at least not legally. So when Kelton says currency here, again, of course, she means base money. And obviously, bank deposits and other forms of debt do come from somewhere else, other forms of dollar-denominated debt. It's true that liabilities of the government can only come from the government. Similarly, liabilities of Derek Van Gorder can only come from Derek Van Gorder and not anywhere else, at least not legally. But what's special about the government's liabilities is that we are using them as our base money. They're the interface between our monetary system, our payment system, and then the goods, right? We don't necessarily have to use the government's currency or the government's liabilities as our base money. The US government just happens to be providing an instrument that works great as base money. And the US dollar is sufficiently stable to be adopted and maintained as the economy's pricing and payment standard.
Yeah, I don't know if Bethany, you have any comments on that. I'm still sort of thinking about it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think this one, Yeah, I don't have too much to say about it. I think it's pretty straightforward. I agree with what you said about it, Alex.
Yeah, I think it just kind of reinforces what we've already been talking about. So let's go to the next one. Since the federal government is the sole manufacturer of US dollars, we can think of it as having a monopoly over the dollar itself. It's kind of like being given a super copyright, one that never expires, over the ability to make additional copies of the dollar. It's an exclusive power articulated by our founders. It's not something that households and businesses or state and local governments can do. Only the federal government can issue our currency. Everyone else is merely a currency user. So this is the currency issuer versus currency user distinction that she draws, that kind of comes up again and again in MMT. And it's true, as we were saying, that being a base money issuer is a somewhat special position to be in. What's not true is that the base money issuer gets to be the base money issuer just because of what someone wrote in a legal document. If the US government stops managing the US dollar properly, we will find something else to use as our base money. So to maintain their status as the base money issuer, the US government is bound by economic constraints. Legal protections are not going to free them from these constraints. The distinction between currency issuers and currency users isn't about the law. It's about where you fall on the hierarchy of money and credit. If your liabilities are widely trusted, then that allows people to use them as money. Did you have something, Stephanie?
Yeah. I was going to just say that it's interesting because, of course, at the time of the founders, we had a gold standard. So her whole view of money is a little bit different than what they would have been envisioning. But she kind of glosses over that, sort of almost to imply that the Constitution really wanted the government to have sovereign money power, which is something that by her own definition actually came about much later when we left the gold standard, because she kind of defines it as something you don't quite have if you have to pay your money back in terms of gold or another country's currency or something like that. So yeah. I think it's a little like just a little bit sort of selective emphasis on history here in terms of what gives the money power, and this idea that maybe like this was a premeditated thing that the government should have this power in the Constitution is, I think, implied here, but not necessarily accurate historically.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, to give a little bit of context, during the founding of the country, the dollar was initially a silver standard, or a bimetallic standard, between silver and gold. We became a pure gold standard later on. But part of the reason why this was articulated in the Constitution was because during the Revolutionary War, we issued a lot of fiat currency called continentals. And they wanted to prevent something like that from happening again, because there was, the value of it got inflated away because they just kept printing these notes that they weren't able to back up with the promise that they could be exchanged for something, right? So they really tried to tie the currency to the silver dollar. We were originally it was based on the Spanish dollar, which we'd been using informally here for a long time. But you're right. It's not, the Constitution isn't thinking about MMT. I think MMT likes to envision itself as kind of describing how things actually work and how they've always worked. And they like to dig back in history and find examples of things that kind of support their way of thinking about how the monetary system works.
I want to emphasize that I think it's important I understand that Stephanie Kelton is creating a kind of simplification here and trying to tell a simple story to make sense of all this. And I'm not, Kelton's very much aware of broad money and the fact that there are these other, that banks, that loans create deposits. When I took a class on MMT, this was something they like hammered into us over and over again, was like loans create deposits, right? So they get it. And I think that the problem is that they've left that part out of their sort of simple story of money, and now it's becoming all about the base money here. And when you're talking about the founding of the U.S. and the modern monetary system in the U.S. and the creation of the Constitution and what it says about what we should do with money, I mean, clearly people were using money before this, right? And so I don't know how helpful it is to go back to any one point in history. I think it's better to just try to talk about how money works, what it is. And I do find it a little bit of a disadvantage of them to them that they leave out this other part of it, this private sector money part of it. They don't emphasize that much in the sort of founding narrative myth that they have. I found it really useful when I'm trying to get into the same kind of debates that MMT is getting into with people who are, Austin calls them hard currency people, people who are against deficits, right? I find it really useful to remind people that, oh, by the way, like, a lot of money comes from banks. Like, this is an ordinary part of the economy that money is created. But MMT doesn't really get to do that, right? Because they really want to emphasize that it's the government that's sort of making all this possible. And I think they're actually making the debate a little bit harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, I guess there's certain choices about what to include in the narrative that she's making and that MMT supporters kind of tend to make in general. Certainly, Stephanie Kelton knows about the hierarchy of money and credit, and she's written papers on that. So it's not something that she's just ignoring entirely. Yeah.
But when you make a statement like that and you say that the government is the only one that issues it and businesses can't, it's like, well, that's not correct. That's not correct, right? You can't really grant that, even as a simplification.
Well, it is correct kind of tautologically if you're really defining currency to be, and you're defining US dollars to be the base money. But I think there's like most people reading this are not going to really restrict that in their head necessarily.
Most people want to think of their bank accounts as having money in them.
Yeah, right? And really they do, right? So let's go to the next one. Here we go. To take full advantage of the special powers that accrue to the currency issuer, countries need to do more than just grant themselves exclusive right to issue the currency. It's also important that they don't promise to convert their currency into something they could run out of. For example, gold or some other country's currency. So money is always a promise for goods, right? Goods are something you can run out of. There's no escaping this constraint. Maybe you're accidentally constraining yourself on the wrong things, but there's always something you can run out of that you're making promises for. Like that's what money is. A base money issuer has to promise to convert that base money into goods. Otherwise, what you have isn't money. Kelton is making an important point that sometimes base money issuers are unnecessarily constraining themselves by making promises they don't have to make, but it's still important to recognize the external constraints that are unavoidable.
That was very clear. Yep, I agree entirely.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that if you have something like a gold standard, then I think you would say, Alex, that you're constrained in two ways now. Like you're constrained still by goods and trying to keep a price level with respect to goods, and then you're also constrained by gold and trying to keep a price level with gold. So there is a meaningful distinction that she's getting at here, where countries that say are using another country's currency as the standard for their currency, or even just using another country's currency, but let's say it's like a par where they're trying to keep an exchange rate with another country, that's going to constrain them in a different way. Now they can't necessarily optimize with respect to resource use because they also have to keep this other par. And so I do think that's important. And I think that that's in a sense what she's drawing attention to, because she's saying like you might be limited in your ability to be a prosperous society if you have these extra constraints.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're pegging your currency to gold or to a foreign currency, then what you're essentially doing is you're trusting that the gold or the foreign currency will be stable enough, and you're saying, okay, we're going to piggyback on that stability. But that limits also what you can do, especially if there is more room for spending in your domestic economy. You can't do monetary policy that's too expansionary without causing, an outflow of reserves, an outflow of gold, or an outflow of your foreign currency reserves. So that is limiting. So there comes a point where, like, if you're a small enough country or a small enough, even a city or a state in the United States, maybe the best thing to do is just to use the currency from above, right? But then you get to a certain size where that's maybe overly constraining. And when we talk about the EU, maybe there's some controversy there. Like, are countries unnecessarily constraining themselves? That kind of thing. There's more we can get into with the EU. They could have brought the government more fiscal decision making up to the level of the whole monetary union, and that might have solved the problem too. But they have this kind of they're stuck halfway. They have monetary policy at the level of the union, and then fiscal policy at the level of individual countries, and that makes it really, really difficult. So there are these real constraints, or these actual constraints that you have by deciding to manage your currency in a certain way? Are you managing it by, influencing markets to adjust the price, to keep the price of goods stable, or you're more directly pegging to another currency? And sometimes the best decision is to peg to another currency. Sometimes the best decision is to, peg to gold or something like that. I think it was in the 19th century. And then sometimes the best decision is to let your currency kind of float relative to other countries and focus on price stability. Yeah.
I really like this idea of the difference between a gold standard and a good standard. And whereas MMT is going to say, well, in order to keep your currency sovereign, you want to avoid these constraining promises. I think you're saying it's more like, well, no, we've just picked the wrong constraining promise, right? That's the problem with the gold standard. It's not that like, oh, this prevents us from doing the sovereign currency thing where we can just print as much money as we deem is appropriate. It's like we're focusing on the wrong constraining variable. You can operate base money as a promise for gold. Maybe everybody just really likes gold a lot, but actually, even if you really think gold is awesome, consumer goods are also kind of important.
Yeah, consumer goods are what the economy is about. So you peg to gold, you have a gold standard when that's kind of the best you can get, when gold is kind of like the most stable thing you can imagine pegging to with respect to consumer goods. And maybe you don't have the ability to keep your currency stable with just by going into the markets and influencing financial markets and that kind of thing. And then in the 19th century, you had globalization, right? Suddenly there was like a lot more international trade, or it had been building to that point. And you had these individual sovereign countries, but then they're trading with each other in kind of a wild west or something like that, right? There's no money for international trade, and there's no institutions that manage the money for international trade. So you had to settle on something that people generally value in a kind of stable way, and then gold became the international monetary standard, right? But once you have more global institutions, like you could say that the Bank of England was moving in that direction back then, and you could say that the Fed has kind of filled in this role now. And to some extent, the ECB and some of the other big central banks are kind of cooperating and forming like a international institutional monetary framework, right? So you don't need gold anymore as an international standard. We have the international dollar as our international standard. Let's go to the next quote here. When a country issues its own non-convertible fiat currency and only borrows in its own currency, that country has attained monetary sovereignty. So monetary sovereignty is an important concept for MMT, but as Kelton points out in the footnote, monetary sovereignty is a continuum. Every currency, even fiat currency, is convertible in a sense. The question is, convertible to what? All currency is ultimately convertible to goods. Even gold was chosen as a currency because it was convertible to goods on a fairly stable and consistent basis. A country's currency has to be anchored to something. And if you're not in a position to anchor your currency directly to goods, you have to anchor it to something that is anchored to goods, i.e. someone else's currency. So this is exactly what we were talking about. So we can reinterpret Kelton here by saying that a country's degree of monetary sovereignty is perhaps the degree to which that country's currency can be kept stable directly with respect to goods.
Why do you think there's such a discrepancy between what it says in this footnote and then the language that comes before it?
I think she's just trying to create a simple story. This is what monetary sovereignty means. Like you have to have all these things, and then like all the MMT stuff that we talk about, monetarily sovereign nations being able to do applies. And then in the footnote, she's just being more nuanced. She's acknowledging that, hey, like some countries are more monetarily sovereign than others, and that kind of constrain. The constraints are greater or smaller depending on how monetarily sovereign you are, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I would just add here, this is kind of my point from before, that you kind of made my point from before, which is like, is it just about goods, or is it kind of having to be connected to multiple pars in a way?
Right, that's exactly right. So let's go to the next one. Countries with monetary sovereignty then don't have to manage their budgets as a household would. They can use their currency issuing capacity to pursue policies aimed at maintaining a full employment economy. So obviously, when governments aren't unnecessarily constraining themselves, they can do more. We don't want governments needlessly holding themselves back from doing the best they can for their people. But a question we can ask is, why full employment? The idea of full employment is a common theme in MMT and other mainstream economics policy discussions. From my perspective, jobs are a way of getting people to spend their time doing something different than what they'd ordinarily want to do. Jobs impose a cost, and the cost is only worth it if the benefit of the product of the labor outweighs the cost. Employment for employment's sake seems like bad economic policy, and the idea of full employment as a goal feels like having a goal of keeping people arbitrarily busy. So why should we want to require people to work more than the minimum amount necessary to achieve our desired level of economic output, or a desired distribution of economic output? Part of the reason why Kelton emphasizes full employment is that MMT views the value of money as fundamentally deriving from taxes and labor. In the MMT economy, less employment means weaker money. But if money is a promise to pay goods, employing everyone isn't going to help a government keep that promise. And if you're forcing people to spend their time less productively than they otherwise would, that means fewer goods and lower possible levels of government spending.
Well, she just adds as a footnote here, full employment, because she assumes it's not going to cause any controversy. It does with us for all the reasons you talked about. But most people think that's the sensible thing to do. Okay, right. This is the goal of the economy is we don't need to manage the budget. We need to manage full employment. That's how they're thinking about it. We, of course, would talk about much more about consumer goods. But let's sort of zero in on just this idea of the budget, right? Like the nature of the government's budget. Kelton has obviously made it a kind of project to tackle arguments about how the size of the we have a limited budget to work with. The size of the government deficit is getting too big. She's really pressing against that. Why what is the nature of the government budget, right? Like the purely on paper. Here's how much we're spending. Here's how much we're taxing. Clearly this seems important to a lot of people. I know that we don't think of it as particularly important. Stephanie Kelton doesn't think of it as particularly important, but she does seem to find it much more important to debate that point than you do. So what's your just take on just the raw numbers of the government budget? What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do what you need to do to maximize the benefit that your people get from the government, so the public benefit. And then you just look at the numbers, and whatever they are, that's what they are. Whatever the deficit is, that's what it is. And whatever if you've got your optimal economic policy and then you look at the deficit, you can be like, oh, well, I guess that was the optimal deficit, right? So that's pretty much how I would look at these numbers. I wouldn't say that it's useful to kind of ahead of time say we want to target a particular balance between taxes and spending. And part of the reason is that you could imagine deficits that don't really make a difference at all. Like if I spent $4 quadrillion into a hole, if I'm the government and I spend $4 quadrillion new dollars into a hole in the ground, that's a deficit of $4 quadrillion. But it's not, that money isn't going into the economy, right? So you have a deficit there that's utterly meaningless. So you can kind of come up with these examples, and the effect of government spending depends on how it's distributed in the economy and where it goes. And that's the same thing is true of the effect of taxation, right? So if you spend and tax the same amount even, that can have different effects depending on where you're spending and where you're taxing. If you give everyone $1,000 and take away $1,000 from the exact same people, it has no effect on the economy. If you add $1,000 to the beginning of the production pipeline and then people spend that money through the production pipeline, and then you tax that $1,000 out the other end, what you've done is you've created a flow of money that has a size of $1,000 and has a starting point and an end point, and it activates production along the way. So taxing and spending don't even cancel each other out. They're not, if you can imagine, the money does in the economy does have to come from somewhere. It has to be spent into the economy, and then it does kind of have to go somewhere. But tax revenue is only one of the places that money can go. It can also accumulate in hoards. People can buy government debt, that kind of thing. So it's not one-to-one spending and taxing that they kind of have to line up with each other.
So it's fair to say that in one sense you completely agree with Stephanie Kelton's kind of main thrust here, that It's not the budget that matters, it's the effects of the budget. Where you disagree is what you think those effects, what effects we should be paying attention
It's
to.
not even the effects of the budget. It's the effects of whatever the government's fiscal policy stance is and whatever their monetary policy stance is. And then you can look at that and derive a budget from what happens to be happening in the economy. Like the budget is not, it's not like you pick the budget and then you have to pick the right budget. It's you pick the right policy and then that implies a budget or something like that.
It's weird to target a nominal budget.
That's right. Yeah. All right, let's go to the next one here. MMT helps us to see why countries that fix their exchange rates, like Argentina did until 2001, or that take on debt denominated in a foreign currency, like Venezuela has done, undermine their monetary sovereignty and subject themselves to the kinds of constraints faced by other currency users, such as Italy, Greece, and other Eurozone countries. So what's the direction of causation here? Did Argentina and Venezuela really undermine their monetary sovereignty because they took these actions? Or did they take these actions because they already lacked sufficient monetary sovereignty to do otherwise? And if it was the latter, what prevented them from having a higher degree of monetary sovereignty? These are interesting questions, and we've explored them on Boston Basic Income before. Anyway, I think it's a little disingenuous to claim that these countries undermined their monetary sovereignty by pegging their currencies or taking on foreign denominated debt. The Eurozone, on the other hand, is perhaps an example of a more voluntary forfeiture of monetary sovereignty. So maybe we can be a little more critical of that decision, how they set things up there.
Just really briefly, what exactly in the MMT view is the problem with fixing an exchange rate?
So the problem with fixing an exchange rate is essentially what you're doing is you're kind of creating this hard par constraint that we talked about before. So now your central bank has to maintain par. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1, but there's some ratio that it's maintaining with the foreign currency. And then you don't have this wiggle room that we talked about when you're anchoring your currency to goods directly instead of to a specific unit that has to remain fixed in terms of.
You've anchored it to a foreign currency, kind of like how you could anchor it to gold.
Yeah, it's just like that. Exactly the same thing. So let's see. Let's go to the next one here. More importantly, having monetary sovereignty means that a country can prioritize the security and well-being of its people without needing to worry about how to pay for it. So I just want to emphasize here that they still have to worry about where to get the resources from. Kelton would agree that if you're a monetarily sovereign state, that is your version of how to pay for it.
I mean, yes. But she does spend a lot of time using language saying like, well, we don't have to pay for it in the way that most people are defining paying for it today. It is true, right, that even when the government fixes that problem, ideally, every ordinary people will still be paying for goods with money that they've previously collected, right? So I don't know. I wonder to what extent this will be kind of a perennial problem, people confusing these two different meanings of pay for things.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's about the level of the hierarchy. And I don't think Kelton does a great job, at least in this chapter, kind of explaining what the equivalences are. So in order to understand what the contrast is between a household and a government, you have to be able to, draw analogies as well and be able to show where they're the same. You can't highlight the differences without really explaining the similarities. And I think she draws a more black and white picture than there actually is. So I'm hoping that as we talk about it, we can kind of open up people's thinking about it. Okay, well, the government has to pay for things because they have to get the resources from somewhere. The resources are what's above them in the hierarchy. And we have to pay for things by getting, we could also do it by getting resources from somewhere, but we can also just get money from somewhere, which is more convenient because it stands in for resources. All right, let's go to
I
the
think
next.
that I was just going to say that she talks a lot, as Derek said, about even sort of the specific laws that Congress has passed to be able to pay for things with a balanced budget or have things be budget neutral and so on. So I think I can forgive her a little bit for emphasizing paying for it in the way that is so obviously important to normal people and politicians, right? It's sort of like kind of makes sense to me that she doesn't immediately go to this other layer of abstraction with goods and so on to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And she's writing for the general public. And she's really, like, as we've emphasized before, she's trying to break them of this idea, or break them free of this idea that we have to constrain ourselves by balancing the budget in nominal terms.
I think the point here is that people's intuitive need to know where the money is coming from, that things need to balance out, that things need to be paid for. That's not a bad intuition, because the resources are limited, right? And people's intuitions are somehow stem from that relationship. We understand that, like, there's only so much goods we can enjoy. We can't print our way. We can't just print money. That on itself isn't useful. They understand that the goods have to come from somewhere. So I rather than saying adding the base money as a promise for goods is kind of another layer of abstraction, I would hope that it kind of simplifies it, because I think people who have this concern are responsive to the idea that ultimately what's paying for it is the stuff, the real stuff. That's what's important, and not the fact that someone happened to have collected money previously. That might be convenient in the market for most of us to have that restriction. It might be convenient for businesses to have that restriction in place. But, like, I think most people could understand that, what pays for the government spending is goods. That's not too hard a concept to get through.
Yeah, I think rather than stamping out people's intuitions, we can say, hey, your intuition is right, and here's how it applies to a government.
Right.
Let's go to the next one. According to conventional thinking, the government relies on two sources of funding. It can raise your taxes, or it can borrow your savings. Taxes allow the government to collect money from people who have it, which means taxes are looked upon as a way to transfer money to the federal government. If the government wants to spend more than it collects by taxing, it can raise additional funds by borrowing from savers. So if we think of borrowing as the issuing of debt, then this is exactly right. Government spending is a form of borrowing, and taxation is the withdrawal of that debt from the market. The amount by which government spending exceeds taxation, i.e. the budget deficit, is the net change in government borrowing. But there is still an important point here, which is that people often think of borrowing as the taking of something with a promise to give it back later. When the government borrows, they're not always borrowing in this sense. That is what they're doing when they issue treasury securities in exchange for base money, but it's not what they're doing when they issue the base money itself. Again, base money constitutes the promise without implying that anything was taken in exchange for the promise. Sometimes the government spending can buy goods and services directly, but it doesn't have to. On the other hand, the issuance and sale of treasuries is essentially an exchange of one kind of government debt for another, one kind of government issued money for another. It is the act of government spending that actually adds new government debt to the market. The way we typically do deficit spending is to combine both of these actions. We replace base money with treasuries, then spend the same amount of base money back into the economy for a net increase in treasuries. Then the Fed responds by replacing some of the treasuries with base money as needed. If the government, for whatever reason, switched to spending money without issuing corresponding treasuries, it would then be up to the Fed to do all of the swapping of base money for treasuries. You'd get the same result either way.
You're essentially trying to say that there's a broader concept of borrowing, and what people have in their heads when they're thinking about what the government is supposed to be doing in this case is one particular type of borrowing. But there's lots of different types of borrowing. In general, when they're spending money, when they're spending the base money into the economy, you're saying that's more of this issuance of a promise. It's not the here I'm making a promise to go collect money and then fetch it for you.
Yeah, it's again this idea when we think of borrowing, it's like taking something and promising to give it back later. Here you're doing the promising without doing the taking of something, but it's still debt. You're still issuing debt. So some people might not want to call that borrowing. I call it all borrowing. I think it's simpler that way.
People do make these kind of borrows. People do make these kind of promises in their lives. When you promise to, do your chores for the roommates or something, I mean, that's a promise you've created. You didn't collect someone else's promise to do your chores from someone else first. You just made it on the spot. It has real effects though on you and your roommates.
Right. Sometimes it's, people by default think of borrowing as a transactional thing, but promising doesn't necessarily have to be. So I think that's where the confusion creeps in. So let's go to the next one. In either case, the idea that the government must come up with the money before it can spend. The idea is that the government must come up with the money before it can spend. That's how most of us have been taught to understand the government's fiscal operations. Taxing and borrowing come first, spending last. So the government taxes and it spends. I don't think the order particularly matters. The whole point of borrowing, in fact, is that it allows you to spend by issuing new money without having to get it from somewhere. So that's exactly what the government's doing. That's exactly what anyone is doing when they're borrowing. Kelton is emphasizing that people tend to think of taxing as having to come before spending rather than the other way around. But that's not where people are stuck. They're stuck on the idea that taxing has to match spending in amount, not which one happens to come first. Budget deficits make them uneasy, even though we run budget deficits all the time.
In the course on MMT that I took, this was justified in reference to, it kind of took this historical lens again, right? And there was a narrative about how originally, right, the government taxed first before it could spend them. It had to, one of these things had to precede the other or something. And I don't know if yeah, I just agree with you. I don't think the order is that important. I don't think that's really what matters.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in our quotes here. Where is it? There it is. Whoops. To get the population to do all that work, the government imposes taxes, fees, fines, or other obligations. The tax is there to create demand for the government's currency. Before anyone can pay the tax, someone has to do the work to earn the currency. So this is the MMT taxes drive the currency view.
Isn't there kind of a contradiction here, right? Because on one hand, she's trying to say that it's not that the taxes don't have to come before the spending, but on the other hand, on a deeper theoretical sense, MMT is saying taxes do sort of come before. They drive value to the currency. They're what is causing the acceptance of the currency to happen.
Yeah, so I think so taxes can mean two different things. So I think that's where we're getting hung up here, is that there's the taxation policy, which has to come first, then the spending, and then the payment of the taxes. So when they say the spending comes before the taxes, they say the spending comes before the tax revenue is collected. But before all of that, you institute the tax policy.
Right, which is kind of funny. And then I've heard a lot of people go through this maze and then come up with the conclusion that, like, oh, well, this is just semantic because it's the same thing. We need the taxes. So why, you're just telling, it all adds up in the end of the same thing. You need to take the taxes to get all the spending to function in the first place. So why isn't that right? What's the problem with this?
Well, it's not wrong. That's one way you can get people to do things, right? And that's one way you can give value to a currency. It's not the only way, right? It's one, like MMT has the story about, colonists go in and they tell the natives, we'll put you in jail if you don't give us, these tokens that only we can provide. That's a way to get them working. It's not wrong, right? It doesn't speak to the nature of money. So money, you can get a pricing and payment standard of stable value in other ways. This mechanism will turn up here and there, and it's certainly part of things, but it's not the whole story. Certainly, you have to have a single unit, right? There's a reason why, you could have taxes that are taxed in various different units. The government could tax hammers and cows directly, right? But there's a reason why they tax in a standard unit. And there's a reason why they tax in the same standard unit that everyone else uses. There's a reason why, even if the government taxed in their own standard unit and it wasn't a unit that was stable enough for everybody to use as their currency, then people would use something else as their money, and they'd go exchange it for government tokens come tax time or something like that, right? So it can't be the whole story of money. There's this standard that both the pricing and payment standard that both the government needs and the private economy needs. The government is in a unique position to provide a stable pricing and payment standard, to provide the base money for all of the economy's money, but they're not going to automatically turn something into money just by making it the tax unit, the thing that they collect with taxes.
The intuition I try to check this against is just that, like, it seems to me anyway, that there's lots of people in the economy who really like money and like collecting it and like getting rich. And I just can't, it doesn't seem intuitively right to me that the only reason they would want to do that is because they're being forced to pay taxes, right? Like, surely there's some such thing as a profit motive, aside from, in the absence of taxation. If you happen not to get taxed that year, the government, or you were really good at evading it, like you wanted to get the money, you were getting something really useful out of collecting the money for its own sake.
Well, in fairness to MMT, even if you are not the one who pays the taxes, if the paying of taxes is what gives the token value and the token can still be traded by you, you might still want to.
You could be like a free rider and you're riding off of everyone else getting taxed in their view. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, that's kind of their story, is that taxes drive the currency. All I'm saying is that can't be the story of money. It can be a story about one way to get people to value the token.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that it seems neither necessary nor sufficient, in the sense that, like, at least at this point, once the currency is established, I don't know if they make a distinction there, but you could certainly imagine that even if we didn't have taxes, if other things stayed the same, we might continue to use the dollar, and the dollar might continue to have value. And as you said, there are other ways that currencies have gotten value. And then sufficient has to do with, of course, what you said, which is, like, if the currency isn't functioning well in other ways, then the taxation is not necessarily going to be sufficient for people using it as their currency either.
So let's do another quote here. We're getting toward the end. This isn't the explanation you'll find in most economics textbooks, where a superficial story about money being invented to overcome inefficiencies associated with bartering, trading goods without the use of money, is preferred. In that story, money is just a convenient device that sprang up organically as a way to make trade more efficient. But that is why money exists. There's a reason why the government taxes in a standard homogeneous, stable unit. And then she goes on to say that although students are taught that barter was once omnipresent, a sort of natural state of being, scholars of the ancient world have found little evidence that societies were ever organized around barter exchange. So my question is, which students were ever taught that? I think most economists understand that a shared pricing and payment standard is necessary for any large-scale market economy. And this is precisely because barter is not a natural state of being. It's too inefficient. You wouldn't expect to go back in archaeology and find evidence of barter economies, because what made the economies possible was that they had money. And then money doesn't mean coins necessarily. It can just be debts that are denominated in a standard unit or something like that. So I think this is kind of like the myth of barter, is what MMT likes to call it. But I don't think there's any myth of barter in standard economic thinking, except as kind of an illustration of why money is always necessary. And I think that's perfectly valid. So let's see if I can get to one more quote to wrap us up.
I'll just say quickly that it seems like what is relevant to her is the fact that you might have cases where there's money but no taxation, which I suspect exist in, like, smaller scale societies, but maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So let's just go to this will be the last one, and Derek has to zoom out, so it's okay if you have to leave right now.
Thank you. Oh, I can hang for one more.
Okay. Here we go. Viewed through the lens of MMT, we see that the US government is nothing like a household or a private business. The key difference is simple and inescapable. The government issues the currency, the US dollar, and everyone else, households, private business, state and local governments, and foreigners, merely uses it. This gives Uncle Sam an incredible advantage over the rest of us. Uncle Sam doesn't need to come up with dollars before he can spend. The rest of us do. Uncle Sam can't face mounting bills that he can't afford to pay. The rest of us can. Uncle Sam will never go broke. The rest of us could. So I think this is kind of a summary of her point in this chapter. And what we're trying to call attention to here is maybe that there are some similarities that are maybe not readily apparent from reading Kelton's text.
That's about it. Yeah. Thank you. I've got to run, but this was interesting. And I'm looking forward to getting into more detail on the next chapter, inflation, which I think will be super relevant.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This is a great discussion.
Everyone.
Next week, we talk about chapter 2, which is Think of Inflation. So this is where MMT is getting more into less about what constraints aren't there and more into what constraints are there. And I have some serious criticisms of how she describes that as well. So that should be an interesting discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, gonna open it up here.